Living next to Mike was a blessing. He was the nicest neighbor anyone could ask for, always lending a helping hand. We shared stories, beers, and even helped each other with household chores. But there was just something off about him, and I couldn't quite figure it out. One gloomy evening, as rain poured down outside, Mike came over with a bottle of whiskey. He was more talkative than usual, and I could tell he was trying to hide something. We chatted about life, work, and the usual stuff, but his eyes darted around nervously. As the hours passed, he excused himself to go to the bathroom. While he was gone, I couldn't help but notice a few drops of blood on his shoe. I wondered what exactly I saw. Should I ask him? Was I thinking too much? Maybe I was just thinking too much. It could just be something else. When Mike returned, I couldn't help but stare at the bloodstain on his shoe. He noticed my gaze and quickly explained it away, saying he'd accidentally cut himself earlier. I tried to brush it off, but the unease stayed with me. Days turned into weeks, and Mike's behavior grew even more suspicious. He began making late-night trips to his garage, where strange noises would emanate, like muffled screams. My stomach churned, and my thoughts wasn't really helping. Something was wrong. I had to find out. One evening, I decided to follow him. I tiptoed through the rain-soaked night and hid behind a tree, watching as he went into the garage. What I saw would haunt me forever. Inside, there was a bound and gagged person, terrified and pleading for help. I couldn't believe my eyes. My friendly neighbor, Mike, was involved in a heinous crime. I was paralyzed by fear, torn between exposing his actions and protecting my own life. My heart raced, and I retreated back to my apartment, unable to sleep. The days that followed were excruciating. I knew I had to do something, but I couldn't go to the police. If Mike found out I had discovered his secret, I'd be in grave danger. The guilt weighed on me, and I couldn't look at him the same way. One night, I heard sirens blaring and saw flashing police lights outside. My heart sank, and I knew the authorities were closing in. I watched from my window as they arrested Mike, his dark secret finally catching up with him. But the story didn't end there. It took a dark and unexpected turn when the police uncovered the gruesome truth. Mike wasn't the one behind the crimes. He was actually a victim, forced to participate by a ruthless criminal who had been living in our neighborhood all along. My world crumbled. The friendly neighbor I had suspected was actually an innocent man, trapped in a web of violence and despair. The true criminal, living among us all this time, had manipulated my perception, deceiving me into believing that Mike was the villain. The guilt and shock I felt were overwhelming. My actions had not only failed to save Mike, but had also led to his false arrest. I had misjudged my neighbor, and the true menace had gone unnoticed, lurking in plain sight. As the real criminal was apprehended, my emotions were a chaotic mix of relief and remorse. I had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and sometimes even the friendliest of neighbors could be victims in the darkest of schemes. The horror story had unfolded right before my eyes, and I was left with the scars of my own misjudgment. The Garden, Parker. I moved into a new neighborhood a few weeks ago, and I couldn't help but notice the house next door. It's an old, run-down place with an overgrown garden that's practically swallowing the building. My new neighbors warned me to stay away from it, saying it's cursed or something, but I'm not really superstitious. One sunny afternoon, I was feeling adventurous, so I decided to take a closer look. The garden was a jungle of tangled vines and thorny bushes, but something about it intrigued me. I couldn't resist the urge to explore, so I pushed my way through the prickly underbrush. As I walked deeper into the garden, I noticed something strange. The plants seemed to move, like they were alive. It was as if they were reaching out to me. The plants appeared to sway and shift, almost as if they were alive, their leaves trembling in the gentle breeze. It was a curious and slightly unsettling sight, giving the garden an unexpected sense of vitality. Feeling a mixture of fascination and unease, I decided to take a step back, contemplating the strangeness of it all. It was as though the garden had a mysterious, almost sentient quality. I couldn't get the garden out of my mind. It haunted my thoughts, and I felt an inexplicable urge to return to the garden. The next day, I found myself standing at the edge of the overgrown mess once more. This time, the garden seemed calmer, almost welcoming. I cautiously stepped inside. The plants remained still, as if they were waiting. I touched a nearby rosebush, and the roses reacted to my touch, blossoming and unfurling their petals. It was like they were responding to me. I couldn't help but feel a strange connection with the garden, as if it were alive and aware. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself spending more and more time in the garden. It became an obsession. I stopped going to work and neglected my other responsibilities. The garden was all I cared about. I couldn't explain the feeling it gave me. It was like an intoxicating drug that I couldn't resist. One evening, as the sun began to set, I ventured deeper into the garden than I ever had before. I discovered a hidden clearing, and at its center was a magnificent tree. Its branches reached out like gnarled fingers, and it seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy. As I approached the tree, a voice whispered in my mind, urging me to touch it. I couldn't resist the compulsion, and when my hand made contact with the tree's bark, a surge of power coursed through me. I felt an immense sense of euphoria, like I was one with the garden itself. I spent more time with the tree, and it began to communicate with me in ways words couldn't describe. It shared its ancient knowledge with me, and I understood that the garden was not just a collection of plants, it was a sentient being, a living entity that had existed for centuries. The garden had been seeking a caretaker, someone to tend to it and nourish it with their presence. It had chosen me, and in return, it granted me unimaginable power. But as my connection with the garden grew stronger, I began to change. My body became thinner and paler, my skin taking on an almost translucent quality. My neighbors became increasingly worried about me, but I paid them no mind. I had transcended the limitations of human existence, and the world outside the garden seemed insignificant. I no longer needed food or water, for the garden provided all I required. But as time passed, I realized that the garden's intentions were not as beautiful as they seemed. It craved something more than just a caretaker. It desired to consume my very essence. It fed on my emotions and memories, leaving me empty and hollow. I knew I had to escape, to break free from the garden's grasp, but it wouldn't release me willingly. As I struggled to disconnect from its influence, the garden fought back, sending thorny vines to ensnare me once more. The battle raged on, and it was a war of wills. I had to summon every ounce of strength I had left to break free from the garden's control. With one final, desperate effort, I tore myself away, leaving behind a part of me that would forever be entwined with the cursed garden. Now, I stand on the other side, looking back at the house next door. My neighbors were right. The garden is cursed, and it nearly consumed me. I can still feel its presence, calling to me, but I must resist. I've learned the hard way that some things are better left untouched, even if they seem beautiful and alluring at first. If you found any enjoyment in the video, I implore you to click that like button and subscribe if you dare.